Good afternoon, good evening. Gateway, what an honor, what a privilege it is to be with you today. I'm so excited for this week and what God is doing and how we are just walking through Palm Sunday, which was 2 days ago on Sunday. And yesterday, Melissa did an amazing job presenting her and speaking and just presenting to us the cleansing of the temple and everything that happened throughout that week, and bring out the illustration of the fig tree that withered. And I just very grateful for what I took away yesterday. And we are in Tuesday of Passion Week, and immediately after the cleansing of the temple, the authority of Jesus begins to be questioned. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these were the religious leaders. These were the ones that were corrupt on the outside. They had everything in order and they followed every law to the T. However, their hearts were rotten and they were wicked. And Jesus begins this process through Passion Week of teaching through parables. A parable is a earthly story or a natural story for us to understand spiritual concepts. And if you recall back in John chapter 3, when Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, he is trying to give him and express the new birth of being born again of the water and of the Spirit. And he is confused. Nicodemus says, how can I, being an old man or an adult, go back into my mother's womb? And Jesus is trying to get him to understand that I am showing you or speaking something on a spiritual context to have in a physical context, to have a spiritual understanding. And that hadn't happened yet. But this is similar to what's happening here. He's talking to the Pharisees and he's giving his expressions. And if you go back to Matthew chapter 21 and you're reading verses 23 through 27, you're going to see that there's this conversation back and forth. And he says, the Pharisees are asking him, what authority do you have to speak in the manner that you're speaking and to do the things that you are doing? And Jesus answers back in a question and he says, well, what authority? Because he understood their heart. It wasn't from a heart of understanding, but it was one of defiance and trying to have an I got you moment. And Jesus responds with the question of, well, what authority did John baptize in? And so the Pharisees, they're thinking on this and they're saying, well, if we say of a spiritual authority, then we have to acknowledge that Jesus is coming in a spiritual manner and it is a spiritual authority, meaning from God. But if we say it's an authority of man, or it was just flesh, or it was just him wanting to do this, then we're going to rile up this entire group that's here, that's excited to see Jesus. And we're going to have a problem either way. And so in their trying to be clever, they say, well, we don't know what authority you have or that John had. And so Jesus's response is, well, I'm not going to tell you either, because if I tell you it's flesh or natural, you're not going to receive it either way. And so Jesus begins to speak and Jesus begins to instruct and Jesus begins to give these parables as a way for minds to be changed and perspectives to be changed. And you have to remember that it does not matter what you think, and it doesn't matter what anybody tells you, because if you're already persuaded or you already have this narrative in your mind, it doesn't matter how anybody tries to convince you or make you see something in a new way. If you are listening to respond and not to understand, then there is no new thought that's going to come into your mind. And so Jesus is saying, it doesn't matter what I tell you, because your mindset is going to be the same. However, let me give you these series of stories or these series of parables to try to change your mind, to change the perspective of heaven and of earth, and try to change the perspective of the authority that I have, and try to change the narrative that yes, we are here on earth and there is a physical kingdom, but there is also a spiritual kingdom. And so Jesus continues to move forward, and he begins to give parables. For example, he gives the parable of the two sons, and there's a father that goes and tells one son to go and tend to the vineyard, and the son says, no, I'm not going to do that. But he changes his mind and he says, okay. And he goes and does it. And then he goes and tells his other son, says, go and tend to the vineyard. And the son says, okay, I'll do it, Dad. And he turns around and he doesn't do it. And so he tells the Pharisees which one is doing the will of the Lord, which one is doing the will of his Father. And so it's a natural parallel of God coming down into our lives and speaking to us. And at first we may not like the context or the thing that God is asking us to do, but when we do it, we are following the will of God. And there's a difference between that and saying, okay, God, I love you, and I saying these things publicly, but yet we go into the same traps, and we go into the same issues that we have without ever changing our heart and without ever being obedient to the one who is speaking to us directly. And there's several parables that Jesus speaks of the wicked tenants and the wedding banquet, and he gives these parables as an understanding that there's more to it than just the outward appearance. And he's talking to the Pharisees, and he's saying, you are like these people. You are like the son that said, yes, Father, I will do what you're asking me to do, and you turn away and you don't. Because it's an issue of the heart. And you will often hear me talk about our heart posture. You often hear me talk about that David was known as a man after God's own heart. However, he committed all these atrocities and all these horrible things, but yet he is remembered as a man after God's own heart. On the opposite side, we're going to hear about Judas, but we have Judas who betrayed Jesus. He was around Jesus. He was with Jesus. He camped out with Jesus. He, no doubt that at some point in his life, he stood up for him and he vouched for him. And for 3.5 years, he was there with Jesus. And at the very end, he says, no, I'm going to do what's best for me. And this is the comparison and the parallel that we can see that Jesus is trying to get to the Pharisees in saying it's not about the outward appearance alone, it's about the inward appearance. Jesus begins to the confrontation on some of the questions that are being asked, because again, the Pharisees are asking him divisive questions, not that the questions are in themselves are bad, but it's in the heart that they're bringing the questions out. And they ask him about taxes, and they ask him, and he says, Jesus says, let me see the denarii, let me see the coin. Whose face is on there? And he says, well, it's the Pharisees say it's Caesar's. He says, okay, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and give unto God what is God's. And he's trying to make them understand that in this natural world, there is still some sacrifice that has to be made because we are to follow the laws of the land. And so that sacrifice is there. However, it doesn't deny or it doesn't take away the sacrifices that must be made unto our God. And so we give God what is his and what is due to him, because at the end of the day, the breath that is in my lungs is not mine. It is a gift. And I am to be a good steward of that. And the words that I speak, the voice that I have, that is not mine, that is God's. And I am to be a good steward of that. And we know that Solomon talks in Proverbs, or he gives in Proverbs, that life and death are in the power of the tongue. And so are the words that I'm speaking bringing life to those who are hearing, or are they bringing down, and are they being destructive, and are they destroying those who are hearing? And so these are all principles that have fleshly examples, but have spiritual implications. Are my words really going to cause life and death? If I'm rude to the waitress, or if I'm rude to my wife, or is it going to cause death? No, not physically, but spiritually and emotionally and mentally. And it causes so much more damage than what we realize. And So Jesus is trying to get these points across to bring a bigger picture of the kingdom that he is setting up here on earth, that it's not a physical kingdom, but it's a spiritual kingdom. And so if you recall on Sunday, I was giving the parallel of Jesus walking in or coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, and how you had two sets of people, those who were ready to take over Rome and those who were ready to defend and say, no, not this guy. Who is this guy? And a lot of that confusion came from the lack of accountability from the religious leaders of those times, who were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it is in them not clarifying and not being specific and not going back into the word and teaching it the way that it was supposed to be taught that brought so much confusion. And so Jesus is trying to lay out this framework that, hey, it's not about the outward appearance alone, but it's about the inward. And he even tells the Pharisees, he says, you're hypocrites. The outside of the cup is clean, but the inside is dirty. And he says, clean the inside of the cup first, meaning clean the inside of the heart first, and then everything else will produce. And so we understand that it is the heart posture in which we ask questions. It's the heart posture in which we go before God. It's our heart posture that will lead to a bigger and better relationship with God, that your heart has to be transformed. Your life can be transformed, but it has to begin from the heart. It has to be on inward and a introspective, God, what do you want from me? And here's the issue though. When people begin to change their lives, if we are not careful, we will begin to measure ourselves with those that we see around us. And our desire for God is going to bring our desire to please God. And so when you begin to understand that we are not to measure one against another, that I am not going to measure my walk with God with your walk with God. I'm not going to measure where I am in my relationship with God to where you are in your relationship with God, because God has given us different callings and different ministries and different plans and different goals, all to reach others, but it's going to look different for each and every one of us. And our families and our marriages and our friendships and our coworkers, they are depending on us, and there is a spiritual opposition that we are coming against. If you recall 2 Sundays ago when I spoke about Jesus being entered, what was the big deal about Jesus coming to the earth? Well, he came to, 1, forgive his people of their sins, but 2, to establish his kingdom. And if you don't understand and you cannot see the fact that we are in a spiritual war and that it's against 2 kingdoms, you have to choose a side. And the issue is that Jesus is saying you can be on either side, but pick a side. Because some of the most miserable people are trying to fight for both, or they're trying to be in the middle of a war that's going on, that they become bystanders and they become miserable, because you know what is right. You know what is good. You know what is pleasing unto God, because he's already been dealing with you. But yet it's so difficult for us to sacrifice and say, you know what? I'm of a new kingdom. I'm a child of God. I am a son, a daughter of God. And he has a plan for me and he has a direction for me. And so this is what Jesus is trying to establish throughout Matthew chapter 21 and 22 and 23 and 24 and 25. He's giving all these earthly parables, earthly examples, earthly stories to bring across a spiritual understanding that it's much bigger than what you think. There's more on the line than what you think. And so when I look at my family, I often tell my boys, you are not my children. You are children of God, and I am so blessed to be your father. God chose me to be your dad on this earth, but I am to steward that. I am to steward what the treasure that he has given me. I am to steward the marriage. You are not just in a marriage. You're not just married to your spouse. You are to steward that. and you were to build them, and you were to uplift them, and you were to encourage them, and you were to help them in their marriage. And one thing I'm going to bring out this coming Sunday is that Sister Melissa did an amazing job bringing out the curse of the fig tree. But one of the biggest things that I feel, or that God revealed to me or showed to me, is that the fig tree was cursed because he didn't know who was standing in front of him. The fig tree, as a kid, I always looked at that story and thought, man, poor fig tree, what did he do? Like, poor guy was just there. And here's the thing. It says implicitly that it was not his season to produce fruit. However, I truly believe that fig tree, the reason that it was cursed, or one of the reasons that it was cursed, was because he did not realize who was in his presence, who was standing in front of him, who was asking him to produce fruit. And so I believe that as we grow in our relationship with God, as we grow in our relationship with him, and we continue this journey, there's going to be times that even when it's not a good season of life, even when it's not a good moment, even when you're in the dumps, you're in the valley, that God is going to require something of us, not out of our own ambition, not out of our own abilities, but because of the one who is dwelling within us. And we have to remember who is in our presence, who is dwelling within us. And that is Jesus Christ, Lord and Savior, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And so even if you are unable to do it on your own, there is a supernatural power that begins to dwell within you as you begin to grow your relationship with God. I'm so looking forward to the rest of this week. And I just invite you on Friday. We are going to be meeting in person. We are going to have an amazing time. We're going to have communion. It's going to be a time of worship. It's going to be a time of devotion. And I just know that God is going to do something amazing on that Friday. And we invite you to invite your friends, family, and come and join us on that Good Friday. Be blessed, and we'll see you when we see you. God bless.